an event that happens. Oh, hold on, there we go. We'll start talking tonight about a fire and rescue call from the year 1999, which may not seem congruent with the topic, but that's what this is all about, right? So in 1999, in March, very early in the month, I was living in a little town called Myersville. A lot of people have never heard of Myersville, Maryland, except they have, they just don't know it. That is where they actually caught the DC sniper. He was in a rest area just about a half a mile west of the town. And so if you've never been to Myersville, now at least you can connect it with a major news story. And in 1999, when I was there, I was an ambulance driver. And I went to bed one night, and you can kind of judge how fire and ambulance calls are going to go by things, oddly enough, weather, full moon, weekends versus weekdays, travel patterns and things. And that night, it sounded like nothing was going to happen. It had been 50 degrees for a couple of days. The snow had all melted off the streets and off the grass. And when we went to bed, I was reassured because there was a 20% chance of flurries. And that was it. And the next day was going to be beautiful and sunny. And so about 3 o'clock in the morning, my pager started to go off. And what was unusual, and you always know that it's a bad thing, it kept going off and kept going off before it gave any information. So it's buzzing away. It's making all of its tones repeatedly. And that means that every time you hear the tones start over, another fire company is being dispatched. So by the time I got upright and looking at my pager to see what was happening, I saw that simply the letters across the screen, PISER, which is personal injury serious. It means that there is either a rollover or an ejection from an automobile in an automobile accident. Somebody's been ejected from a car, or we've got a car on its roof, and they're going to have to be extricated. But then I noticed what was odd is that they had dispatched 6 different fire companies to this accident. Usually, where this one was located, they would dispatch 2, ours, because it was right at the county line of Frederick and Washington County on Interstate 70, and 1 from Washington County, and we would handle it. The only reason that I could think of that it was so many is this had to be a major pileup of multiple vehicles. So we responded. When I ran down the stairs, we had an old country farmhouse, 3 stories. I ran down the stairs and I hit the front porch. I realized that it was so foggy outside, I couldn't see the house across the street. And when I slid off the end of my porch on the new fallen snow that I didn't notice, and fell face first in 6 inches of new snow in my front yard, feeling a little stupid, I realized that our 20% chance of flurries had turned into a major snow squall ahead of an Alberta clipper. And that must have been what caused the accident. And so when we got to the accident scene, there were about 12 to 14 cars involved. And in fact, people had been ejected from vehicles. There were cars turned over on their side. There were cars upside down. And because I was still new on the ambulance, I was already a firefighter, but I was new on the EMS side. My particular job was to supply my medics with whatever they needed from the back of the ambulance. And because of the tremendous danger of having all these vehicles in the middle of the road while you're trying to bring fire crews in, and there's no assault trucks out, everybody was taken by surprise. I was also kind of acting as the safety. And what it gave me time to do is it gave me time to look around and watch what was happening. The snow was still coming down, but I could hear everything on the radio. And what I realized is that just about 2 weeks before, I had been reading the orders of a major by the name of Jonathan Letterman, who was the medical director of the United States Army of the Potomac. The Army of the Potomac is the army around Washington, D.C. that's going to fight the battles that many of us have heard of, like Fredericksburg, First Manassas, Gettysburg, the Wilderness, Spotsylvania. All those are the battles of the Army of the Potomac, right around the D.C. area. And as I'd been reading the orders of Jonathan Letterman after the Battle of Antietam in 1862, I realized that what I was watching on the highway that night was literally almost word for word what he had written in a series of orders on August the 2nd, 1862, talking about how ambulances are to be organized, how they're to be maintained, how they're to be trained, the crews are trained. I also then realized as we started communicating with the hospital and we're bringing our patients down from the mountain because we had no aviation that night. The clouds were so low, the snow was so bad, there was no way that we could get a helicopter in. They would have just as likely crashed into the side of the mountain as gotten to our scene because we literally couldn't see anything. And so we're going to have to do this without aviation. And we were used to, in that part of Maryland, the helicopters of the State Highway Patrol that also do medevac are available just about anywhere in just about any condition. This was unusual. And as I drove the patient down the mountain, still snowing like crazy, I couldn't get out of my head how everything I had just witnessed in the year 1999, I had just read about in one form or another from the year 1862, and it wouldn't leave my head. But I hadn't yet put together exactly why, if you know what I mean. I'm kind of at that point still going, wait a minute, but he wrote this and he wrote that. When we went to the hospital, I reloaded the ambulance with supplies. When we turned around, the snow squall had already passed through. Beautiful, beautiful, clear night. Temperature was starting to come up. Things were starting to melt, and because the pavement was warm, it's melting on the pavement very quickly. Beautiful moon, and as we drove out, I realized that I was driving across South Mountain, about 1.5 miles from where Jonathan Letterman fought his first battle in the Antietam campaign. And it was the first time that he had been the medical director of that army. And it was the first time that he had actually handled his own army as a medical director in the field. And it was that battle and the Battle of Antietam 3 days later, right there in Washington County, not 5 miles from where I was driving, that would be the impetus of this series of orders. And we'll talk about the orders in a second. So I took it back to the fire academy. I was still going through my fire academy work as a firefighter. And I said, why didn't you tell us that this was all developed in 1862? And my instructor said, no, this is the incident command structure. It was all set up in the 1970s. And I handed him these 5 pages written out from Letterman's orders. And I said, no, sir, it was written in 1862. Take a look. And that really got me interested in understanding more how military medicine, especially military emergency medicine and evacuation, how that has changed our world, including, on the civilian side in a very meaningful way. And so to go back a minute now, I had to go find out, well, who is this Letterman and what all did he write? And why did he write it? And so I began a process at that point in 1999 and 2000 of researching Letterman. I found out that in 1862, when he took over the directorship of the Army of Potomac, he had already been in the United States Army as a physician since 1848. He had been in every environment around the country. He had been in coastal regions, he had been in swamp regions, he had been in the mountains, East Coast, West Coast, he had been in the desert, he had been in the high plains, he had seen combat with the natives in both California and during the Seminole Wars. So the man is very well versed in almost everything a doctor would want to know. He'd been in camps, he had been in garrison, and he had been in all these different environments, and he's a very well-rounded physician at this point. And especially for the military, this man understands military operations. He understands diet and health and sanitation and all the things that are going to be important. And in 1862, when he takes over the Army of Potomac, what he sees is an army that has no medical structure really at all. And I'll give you a good example of that. In the early part of the war, every regiment has a surgeon and an assistant surgeon. No one thought to combine multiple regiments together in order to set up a hospital. So if your regimental surgeon and assistant surgeon decide that they can handle the casualties from a battle, they can set up a hospital anywhere they want. but there was nothing really in the orders that told them who they should tell. So imagine you're the director of an army and you have all these hospitals hither, thither, and yon around the countryside. It may only be by accident that you find out the locations of those hospitals, but you're responsible for not only feeding the soldiers in the hospitals and supplying the hospitals with bandages, food, medications, and transportation. You don't even know where they are. I mean, literally, you have no idea where these hospitals are. You have no idea how to supply them because you can't find them. What's more important is we also didn't have an organization to get the men off the battlefield. So the ambulances were literally driving around the battlefield looking for patients. Now, understand something. When we visit a battlefield today, the National Park Service is great about cutting the grass. In the 1860s, nobody was cutting anything. So if you've got men down in a field, you may actually literally not see them in the tall grass as you're driving your ambulance along until you run over them. None of this is good. And we know that at battles like First Manassas, it took more than a week just to find all the casualties and get them off the battlefield. And of course, many of those casualties had died long before they were found, simply because of a lack of care. And in 1862, in August, Letterman, when he very first took over, looked at the organization, the Army's medical department. He said, okay, number one thing, we have got to have a more organized ambulance system. So right now, the way it is, every regiment has 2 ambulances, and they just assign whoever they think should be assigned to an ambulance. They're going to stick them on that ambulance as a crew without any training, without any accountability, without any kind of a specialized uniform that would tell someone during a battle, oh, wait a minute, aren't you supposed to be with the ambulance? Why are you lingering around in this back area? And literally little or no real direction. So what he did is he organized the ambulance system and said, first of all, we're going to have medical personnel in charge of all ambulances, not the regimental officers. And by doing that, he was able for the first time to make sure that the ambulances were under his control so that at all times he could make sure that they were properly maintained, properly organized, more importantly, that they were attached to someone in the medical department that could assist them in finding the hospitals and in keeping those ambulances in communication with one another. Today, we take that for granted. I mean, we've got a 911 system. Every ambulance has a radio. We know where our ambulances are. The ambulance crews are well trained and they're taught where the hospitals are. They're also taught map reading to make sure they know where the patients are. But in the Civil War, until August of 1862, none of that had yet happened. The other thing that he did is he put in charge of these medical officers, he put at the brigade level, which is 5 regiments put together as a brigade, he put a sergeant. At the divisional level, you take multiple brigades, you put them together, you get a division. You take 3 divisions and you put them together and you get a very large corps. So we've got a sergeant at the brigade level, we have a lieutenant at the divisional level, and we have a captain at the corps level, whose entire job is to make sure that nothing but ambulances, they eat, sleep, and breathe ambulances. And what they're going to do is they're going to make sure that those crews are trained, that the ambulances are stocked. And unlike the quartermaster, which quite frankly, during the course of battle, the quartermaster has so many other things to worry about, controlling those ambulances, which had been their job, was simply something they couldn't do well. And so now what we're going to see is these ambulances, for the first time, are going to be properly crewed, properly trained, and properly maintained, which means more ambulances are going to be ready for service at the time of battle. After August, Letterman is sidelined for a time when the Army of the Potomac has moved to Washington, D.C. to take over its defenses. And in September of 1862, Letterman, who's now under the command of General George McClellan, McClellan is going to be called out to stop Robert E. Lee's first invasion of the North. Robert E. Lee comes across in Frederick County, moves toward the city of Frederick, Maryland. He burns the bridge over the Monocacy River there, severing communications between Frederick, Washington, D.C., and Baltimore, Maryland. And he moves out towards the Pennsylvania border. This took the Union Army and especially the federal government by complete surprise. And as you can imagine, with Robert E. Lee now north of the city of Washington, D.C., Congress and the Senate and everyone in D.C. immediately lose their collective minds. Robert E. Lee is going to come into the Capitol. It's going to be the end of the war. McClellan has to save us. And Letterman is part of that campaign. He moves from Washington, D.C. to Frederick, Maryland in a matter of about 3 days. Once he is in Frederick, he's told there's going to be a major campaign, and Frederick is going to be your evacuation hospital site. So he has to set up a number of hospitals in Frederick, but Robert E. Lee just walked out of town with all of his medical supplies. We already had hospitals in the town of Frederick that were military hospitals, but they're going to go from 2 to about 29 or 30. And those buildings all have to be converted. There are churches, public buildings, dormitories, even convents. While Letterman is doing that, he's trying to resupply an army that's now on the march that just took just a terrible beating at the Battle of Second Manassas under a general named Pope. They took Pope's army and McClellan's army and put the two together. Pope's army is woefully short of supplies. Letterman's trying to supply them, and the only railway line across the Monocacy River between Baltimore, D.C. and Frederick is broken. It has been burned by Robert E. Lee, so we have this additional problem. Great, now how do I get the supplies across the river? The quartermaster's worrying primarily about foodstuffs, primarily about ammunition and fodder for the horses, not necessarily medical supplies. 3 days out of Frederick, they're going to fight a battle at South Mountain. Now, if you notice, I just mentioned South Mountain is where that accident was back in 1999. Future for Letterman, past for me. When Letterman got to the battle at South Mountain, just a mile or two from where the accident happened, he began seeing the other problems that were part of the organization of the Army of Potomac. And 3 days after that, he's going to fight the bloodiest single battle in the history of the United States Army, and that's the Battle of Antietam, where we're going to have in a single day over 23,000 casualties. When Letterman goes into the Battle of Antietam, he knows that he is short of a number of supplies. He knows that he has units in his army that were part of Pope's army that never got the organizational orders in order to have an organized ambulance system. So he knows he's in a deficit there. And so what he does during the course of the battle is he does something very important. Rather than going out and providing direct medical care, and rather than going out and trying to supervise the hospitals directly, he sent 3 junior medical officers out, and he had them reporting back to him, and he stayed with the commander of the Army, McClellan. He was criticized for it later. But what he was able to show is that by looking over Letterman's shoulder and making sure he understood all of the orders before they went out to the troops in the field, that he could provide those medical officers, those junior medical officers, with instructions so that the medical department could be proactive in their response, so they could make sure that they were directing supplies ahead of the corps that were being sent into battle, so they could make sure that any extra ambulances that were available for service could be sent into those areas that were about to become hot spots. And after the battle is really the most important part for Letterman, because he spends the next 45 days, first of all, cleaning up the battlefield and evacuating the troops, which took all the way until Christmas. The difference was this time they found all of the patients in the first 24 to 48 hours. Unlike Manassas, this evacuation didn't take a week or 2 weeks. It took a matter of pretty much a day. The second thing that they found when they went into the battlefield is he understood that while supplies were short, he couldn't understand why they were so short. So he's kind of marking this down in his mind. He's looking at the doctors who had set up their own hospitals, and he is saying, okay, I set the primary hospitals up ahead of time. But what I don't understand exactly is why why did the orders not get out to everybody to go to these main hospitals? He kind of puts that in the back of his mind, because he had about 99 hospitals on that battlefield, only about 20 of which he authorized. So the regimental surgeons are still putting their own hospitals out there, despite the fact that he's been trying to consolidate them. And finally, he's looking at it and he's seeing that he has to evacuate these troops through the old battlefield at South Mountain, where he had already set up hospitals in the towns of Middletown and Burkittsville. What he decides to do is he uses the hospitals at Burkittsville and Middletown, and he basically makes it so that, very simply speaking, those hospitals could monitor patients on their way from the Antietam battlefield into Frederick. Patients that needed hydration, patients that may have needed bandage dressings changed, patients that weren't doing well on the trip and needed to rest more could be taken off of the ambulances, and patients from the South Mountain battle could be put onto those ambulances and continue into Frederick. He would also then use those ambulances on their return trip to bring in additional medical supplies. But he realized this still wasn't a perfect solution. So on October 29th, 1862, he wrote an order that, quite frankly, will revolutionize medicine. He's already got the August 2nd order organizing the ambulances, and that worked well. He puts out an order on on October the 9th to reorganize medical supplies. And what he says is that he's going to cut all of the medical supplies to the individual regiments in half. Now, a lot of people at the time said, well, why would you do that? You're cutting their supplies in half, but you got to the battlefield in Antietam without all of your supplies intact. Why would you cut them in half? Why wouldn't you increase them? This is one of Letterman's, I think, great just natural talents. He spent a lot of time asking the question, why? It wasn't enough to know that the doctors didn't have enough supplies. It was far more important to understand why they didn't have supplies. And what he learned was, first of all, doctors were not ordering the supplies in enough quantities far enough in advance of the battle, because they simply didn't have experience in material handling. The second is that a lot of the materials were being wasted by theft, especially things like alcohol, which were in fact important items in the medical chest of the doctors. There are certain medications that had to be mixed with alcohol simply to make them palatable for a human to be able to take a dose. Actually, that's how we got the whiskey sour. It's quinine and alcohol, which was about the only way to get soldiers to swallow quinine because it's so bitter. The other thing that he noticed is what he really needed was more control over the supplies. And so what he did is he established at each brigade level, he established a material handling officer who would do nothing but handle supplies for the doctors. This meant the doctors can concentrate more on treatment and more on actual medical response and less time on paperwork. It also meant that this material handler could protect the supplies from being stolen. And finally, the supplies that the doctor is given to get on the battlefield don't weigh as much. And what he found was that the medical wagons were occasionally breaking down. When they broke down, there was so much supply on the back of them. First of all, they broke easily, but there was no way to simply pick that stuff up and mount it on the backs of the horses that were pulling the wagon and at least get some of the supplies to the battlefield. Under his new system, we should have less waste. The doctors should be paying more attention to their primary duties as caregivers and less as material handlers. But more importantly, now if a wagon broke, a doctor could get on the battlefield with his most important supplies, which were easily found. And let's face it, 50% of your supplies is better than 0% of your supplies when you're going into a fight. And this is what Letterman was allowing for. And finally, then on October 29th, he issued the last order. And the last order said, okay, we don't even have a definition of a field hospital. What is it? It cannot simply be two doctors, a surgeon and an assistant surgeon, setting up hospitals wherever they wish without any kind of communication. First of all, there aren't enough surgeons there. Those two doctors are going to work themselves to death. And there are, in fact, instances after large battles where doctors died at the surgical table from coronaries. They had heart attacks and they died of overwork. Some doctors were known to operate for 2 and 3 days straight without rest, after which they were useless. What he did is he said, from now on, what we're going to do is we're going to have hospitals that are set up according to a distinct order and a distinct command structure. And quite frankly, it's how we manage emergency rooms and hospitals in the Army to this day. The idea was that we're going to appoint a commander, and the commander is in charge of making sure that all of the protocols and all of the organizational requirements of the hospital are actually fulfilled. He is not going to do operations. He is going to run the operation of the hospital. Now, a lot of doctors didn't like that, but the fact is it was going to save a lot of lives, and Letterman proved that. Knowing that the doctor in charge is going to be swamped with a lot of work, he is also given an assistant director who will be in charge of foodstuffs, communications, paperwork, records, and supplies. This is going to relieve the director, the surgeon in charge of those responsibilities. And the assistant directors is very clear what they're to do. When they establish a hospital, the very first thing to do is they write an order off to Letterman telling them where the hospital is, who is there, who's being established there, what corps, what division, and what brigades are going to be served by that hospital. And that goes to Letterman's headquarters so that he can plot it on a map. And so that he can begin to plan, how am I going to relieve them, evacuate them, feed them, and supply them. He is then to immediately have details put together to start boiling coffee and soup so that the men have hydration and nutrition when they get back to the hospitals immediately. The surgeon in charge then will pick the 3 best surgeons from each division, the 3 surgeons who are most skilled at surgery, not according to rank, not according to popularity, only provided on their skill, which means for the first time, the soldiers are guaranteed the highest possible level of surgical care. Your surgeon in your regiment may be a really nice guy. He may even be an excellent doctor. That doesn't mean he's a great surgeon. And in this way, we're ensuring that the primary purpose of the surgeons in the hospital, that those positions are filled with the very most qualified surgeons available. Now, to relieve stress, to relieve fatigue, and to increase the efficiency of the system, each one of the 3 surgeons will be given 3 additional high-quality surgeons to be their assistants. Now, this does a couple of things. First of all, it means that the second tier of surgeons are getting on-the-job training from the first tier of surgeons while they're operating. That's 1. 2, a surgical team of 4 people is going to be more efficient, reduce fatigue on your best surgeons, and we always have someone now to administer anesthesia. And you have to understand, during the Civil War, anesthesia was, in fact, ubiquitous. Yes, they occasionally ran out of it. Most of the time when they did, they stopped operating unless the life was going to be lost immediately without operation. So now we have a team of 4 surgeons, and that team is one of 3 different teams in this new field hospital. So we've gone from 2 surgeons, a surgeon and an assistant. Now we have a total of 12 surgeons in the hospital. The next line of surgeons, we're going to go to them and we are going to pick out a number of what are called dressers. And dressers are your triage officers. We've had triage for years. The Romans had triage. The Greeks had a method of triage. The Russians during the Crimean War in the 1850s had a great system of triage. Triage wasn't new, and a lot of people like to give Letterman credit for inventing triage, but he didn't. What he did is he simply made it so that someone was always in charge of triage, and that was the dressers. What else did the dressers do? Why did they call them dressers? It's not because they had drawers in front and with socks and underwear, I can promise you that. The dressers were there for a very particular purpose. They were there to dress minor wounds, and then to make a decision if a case that was presented to them was surgical, then they would make the decision how to feed that to to the operating teams in the most organized fashion based on the wound survivability. So we now have men who are going into the system who have to pass through these dressers in order to make sure that we're not bogging down our surgical teams with either cases that don't need surgical intervention immediately, or putting them in simply because they're well liked or because they're officers and therefore they're important. All of those things were taken away. The only reason you got to see a surgeon in the order you did was based on survivability of your wound and the principles of triage. And then Letterman has this little sentence, and I love it because it's such a dense read that you have to look at each sentence individually. It says, one surgeon per regiment will return to the field and will present themselves in a position of safety as close to the lines as practicable. What it meant was, for the first time, we now also have what today we would call medics. We're providing first aid. This is the first time that first aid has ever been organized, but it's not just first aid. So now the regimental surgeon, one of the regimental surgeons who's not needed in this larger divisional hospital, is going to go to the field and dress the wounds of the men 50 or 100 yards behind the line. Now, what it means is, first of all, evacuation to somewhere where you're getting some kind of care is much faster, which increases survivability. Second of all, you're not losing a half a dozen men every time a popular guy in a regiment is wounded while his buddies carry him a mile or two back to the hospital. They take him back behind the line 50 yards and return to the line, so we're not losing as many muskets, which conserves fighting strength. Third, that officer in the field is doing a triage himself. Is this patient even going to survive an ambulance ride? There's no point in my putting a patient on an ambulance that's going to die 5 minutes down the road when I could have put two people on the ambulance that were both going to survive long enough to see a surgeon. So this is an important issue as well, because now the triage officers at the field hospital are triaging patients that have already been triaged once for transportation. And what it means is we're not bogging down our transportation system with future corpses. We are putting only those people who are truly patients into the transportation system. But think about it, even more importantly, as I talked about with First Manassas, where they were running through the fields, none of which had been mowed. That's not something you did back then. The only time you would mow a field is when you were harvesting it. But you would have grasses and other things growing that were not regularly harvested during most of the fighting season. You don't want your ambulances running through these places trying to find the patients by not running over them, hopefully. Now the patients can be picked up from a single collection point where the surgeon is doing his work in this sheltered area behind the line. So your ability to speed up the patient from the point of injury to the first level of care, we've sped that up tremendously. The ambulances aren't having to go willy-nilly around the battlefield finding their patients. They're finding them directly at that surgeon station, which means we're getting them off the field more quickly. When they get to the hospitals are not so overworked that they cannot provide food. That's their job and they're doing it. That they cannot provide hydration. Now that's their job and they have people assigned to do it. The surgical teams are only getting those patients which are going to be survivable in the opinion of a physician. Of course, not all of them will survive, but the chances are much better. The surgeons themselves are the finest surgeons within the division. And we know, because of the orders of October the 2nd on logistics, that all of the necessary supplies are coming in. And because Letterman is aware of all of these hospitals within an hour or two of their being established, supplies will continue to flow. We're going to be able to save a lot more patients. Letterman's system literally was a revolution in medicine, not a revolution in technology, but a revolution in organization. And I will tell you that an awful lot of people in Washington, D.C. and among the brass in the Army were very much against this plan. First of all, it meant the quartermaster, who's now lost control of these ambulances, has lost prestige and assets, and no one likes that. Many of the surgeons who thought they were really good surgeons, who are now no longer doing surgery because everyone else doesn't think they're such good surgeons, and they're now acting as dressers, they feel insulted, and they're complaining bitterly. And quite frankly, the fact that we now have supplies flowing correctly, although we've taken away a lot of waste, we've added new ranks to the medical department, which of course costs the medical department money because we have to pay these material handling officers who are all going to be at the rank of a lieutenant. Those lieutenants really didn't exist before. And now it's costing us additional money in salary and in personnel. So there's a lot of things that everyone doesn't like about this plan. One of the things that Letterman did that was so amazing is he sold the plan by looking at the motivation of each one of the groups opposing him. To the surgeons who weren't doing surgery anymore, he said, wait a minute, you became a doctor to save lives. I'm going to show you how this organization is going to save more lives. You're still part of an organization saving lives. As a matter of fact, now you're part of an organization saving more lives. Give me a chance. To the Congress people who were complaining about the cost, he said, well, wouldn't you like more of your voters returned to home alive? No congressman can argue with that. When some of the top brass complained, he said, wait a minute, I'm returning veterans to you. Because I'm getting them to care quicker, more of the people that I put through the hospital are going to be able to return to service, which means you're going to have more veterans in the ranks, which means you're going to have a more able and credible army to fight the war. And it's going to mean morale is going to go up because people know they will be properly taken care of. Mortality rates are going to go down, which is certainly going to make people at home a lot happier that we're taking care of their children rather than putting them into the meat grinder of war without any hope. And what everyone saw was that the medical department for the first time was a major part of morale, esprit de corps, not just of the Army, but of the people of the United States who write the checks. And he did, in fact, put out an Army that was far stronger than it had been in the past because it was returning more veterans to service. And he was keeping the health of the soldiers in other areas very high. The soldiers were more medically prepared to fight the war. But what does that have to do with 1999 on the top of a mountain without aviation? Well, let me tell you. In 1864, there were Prussian Army observers in the Union Army, and they were looking at this medical plan and they were saying, this is brilliant. They actually wrote back to Berlin and they said all efforts towards Austria should be put on hold for 1 year. There had been an anticipated invasion of Austria by Prussia in 1865. They put it off to 1866 specifically to allow Letterman's plan to be brought into the Prussian Army staff system and actually get it staffed and planned so that they would go into the Prussian conflict properly medically prepared. What happened? Well, the Prussian Army won, and they had the lowest mortality rate of any army in the 19th century worldwide. Now, they decided this was a great plan, and they kept it. So in 1870, when Prussia went to war with France in the Franco-Prussian War, they had the lowest mortality rate of any army in the 19th century, beating their own record from 1866. What happens at this point is that the Prussian Army will adopt this plan permanently. They're going to give it a very secret name so that no one will know where they came up with it. It's going to be published in all of the Prussian Army manuals as the American plan. And it will become the plan of a unified Germany and used in the World War I. The French will pick this plan up during the Franco-Prussian War. The British will pick it up as well during the late 19th century. And America, they kind of walked away from it because we didn't fight any major wars with large-scale units between the end of the American Civil War and World War I. We did fight in Cuba, in the Philippines, Guam, Puerto Rico, but not with the large enough units to really make the Letterman plan necessary. We still had parts of it, and in fact, a number of improvements had been made, but we didn't really get the Letterman plan back in a robust way until World War I. The fact of the matter is, most of the world uses the Letterman plan, and they don't even know where it came from. In 2010, I met one of the men who had set up under President Nixon and President Ford, had set up the trauma system we have in the United States today. And part of that trauma system was making trauma hospitals and certifications for trauma centers around the country. And I said to him, I was talking to him about the Letterman plan. He said, "Oh my gosh, those are the same things that we put into play when we started working with communications and the police and fire department trainers in setting up the incident command structure." I said, "Well, that's funny, because when I mentioned this to my instructor back in the fire academy, they said, 'No, that's the incident command structure.'" He said, "But we didn't know where it came from. We thought we were picking it up from the protocols of the United States Army from Vietnam." I said, "Right." And they got it from the protocols in Korea and World War II and World War I. And I showed him a quote from the Army's Director of Medical Services in Europe, Major General Macaulay, who said in 1944 in a personal letter to a friend, "There is not one day I do not thank God for Jonathan Letterman." So let me fast forward another few years for me. I had been a firefighter since 1998. Before that, I was a volunteer police officer in Missouri. And in 2010, my wife called me from upstairs at our church during a church youth event that she was in charge of, and asked me to come upstairs. The fact that she had called me on the telephone from upstairs was unnerving, because my wife doesn't pick up the phone and call anyone if she can go walk to them and talk to them in person. When I got upstairs, she was holding onto her desk with both hands leaning forward, shaking, and she said, "I'm going to die right here, and I don't want to die alone." And I asked her a couple of quick questions. She said, I've got the headache of the century. I've never felt so bad. My vision's going blurry. I can't stand the pain, and I'm weak." And she lapsed into unconsciously. I called 911 and told them that I thought I had either a stroke or a brain hemorrhage of some sort, possibly an aneurysm, and that I needed help immediately. And they picked her up, took her to Washington County Hospital. I saw the CAT scan. All of the pleural spaces in and around the brain were completely filled with blood. It was very clear in the CAT scan what I was seeing. How she survived that far, I don't know. Washington County neurosurgeon said, "There's nothing I can do for her here. She really needs to go to Baltimore. She needs to be admitted immediately into a neurosurgical critical care unit." And they found her a bed at Hopkins. And I watched an ambulance with a helicopter rotor on top land on top of that hospital. Medevac was there. This was not the state highway troopers that I had been used to. This was one of the life flights. They picked her up from Washington County Hospital, and I will never, ever forget, as I'm preparing myself to lose my wife, as I'm preparing myself that she will not survive the night, getting back on Interstate 70. And I'm now driving eastbound, and I passed the site of the 1999 accident on what was on the westbound lanes. I'm headed east now, and I can't help to think that the Letterman plan of October of 1862 had incorporated a structure that was so sound in its organizational methodology, was so well thought out, and the basic questions so well answered, that all these years later, I'm watching my wife fly over the South Mountain battlefield on her way to Baltimore. And the system that is going to save her life, and she is alive and well today, fully functioning, never lost speech, never lost full motor control. It's a miracle. Part of that miracle is Jonathan Letterman from 1862, because in America, after the Civil War, we started to put the field hospital into practice in all of our major hospitals. That's the emergency room. We started to put detailed communications together, just like he had envisioned in 1862, no longer on paper, but now with radio and telephone. He had put together a system that was so solid, it didn't matter what type of ambulance it is or how the ambulance worked. The communications, the organization of maintenance and of training follows the technology. I watched my wife fly over South Mountain Battlefield, and I thought, if she survives this, I owe Letterman again. Most people don't know who this man is. And most people don't understand that what he pioneered here is saving lives today. But I can tell you from the standpoint of a medical first responder at the battlefield, or at the South Mountain Battlefield that night in 1999, and all of the other patients that we served on that interstate over the years. I think at one point I was running 500 calls a year, and about half of them were on that interstate. And watching my wife fly over that same battlefield a few years later, 10 years later, on her way to a neurocare critical care unit, I can tell you beyond a shadow of a doubt, I have no question that Letterman's plan saved my wife and countless others. So when we think of air evac, when we think of flight nurses, which will come about during World War II primarily and after, when we think of fixed wing evacuation, long haul, like we had from Iraq and Afghanistan, going back into Landstuhl, or even if we think back to the fixed wing aircraft bringing patients out of Korea into Japan, or bringing patients out of the islands into San Francisco eventually, or out of North Africa back to England. The fact of the matter is we can't ignore that all of the protocols that were necessary to make that technological system work were in place on the first day of November, 1862. So if anyone has any questions, I'd love to hear them. And if not, that is the end of my prepared words. So now you should be worried because I go into my unprepared words, and sometimes those turn into bad jokes. But anybody have any questions for me? So not hearing you, Taylor, I will turn this back over to you then.
Thank you so much, George. We have recorded this presentation, so if you joined late, we'll be sharing it in our newsletter, on our website, and on our social media pages. And we'll, of course, be tagging our friends at the Army Medical Museum. If you happen to be going through San Antonio, highly recommend that you stop in and visit our friends there. George is the executive director, and thank you so much for your time this evening and sharing your expertise with us. Anybody has any questions about medallions, now is a great time to ask. I think most of the people on the call are from one of our two organizations, but we're hopefully going to be doing more of these speaker series presentations, all of which will be shared looking into next year. So we appreciate everybody coming, and have a great evening.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for the opportunity. I really appreciate it.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. Have a great evening, everybody.
Have a good one.